Hello, everyone. So there's two things that are difficult in computer science, cache and naming things. And it turns out that naming things is quite difficult. I arrived this morning. Emma Watson, are you actually in the crowd? I believe there may, no, like seriously, there is Emma? Okay, Emma didn't make it back after lunch. I do work for the UN. I am British, although you can't tell from my charming Canadian accent. But I am here to talk with you today about why Git is difficult to learn. And it's a bit of a redux with a bit of a twist at the end. There may be an interactive component, can't say for sure, but they have locked the back doors, so you're stuck with me now. And we're going to break this down into three parts today. We'll first talk about why it's difficult to learn as an adult, and more specifically, why Git is quite difficult to learn, where I will then proceed to talk about how to be an effective mentor and tell you why you shouldn't use graphical user interfaces, which will be followed by the next presentation, which will give the counter argument on why you should use a graphical user interface. We do like to keep things fair and balanced here at Git Merge. And then finally, I will talk a little bit about the difficulty of introducing a trivial or just a little change in an organization, and talk a little bit about change management from the business definition of change management instead of the source control version of change management. So let's start out with learning a little bit more about how adults learn. And this is a topic that's near and dear to me. And I've been teaching version control for longer than I probably should admit to. I think the first time that I taught version control was in 2003 or 2004. And I decided that the college program I was teaching, they were liberal arts grads who decided to learn more about technology and take this program. And I, in my infinite wisdom, thought that it would be fantastic if they had all their assignments submitted through version control. And at the time, I knew CVS more than I knew Subversion. So we had the students who'd never really done technology before contributing their assignments in CVS. I'm just going to let you think about how that may have gone for a second. I've learned a lot since then about how to teach version control, and it remains a really interesting topic for me because the experience of the students who come to me they are defeated, they are completely demoralized, they are frustrated. In Paris, I had a fantastic picture of Gollum on stage who just was screaming about his precious, precious code had gone away. And that's how students come to me. So they're a little bit frustrated, and they're ready to learn this wonderful world of Git, but mostly they just want to not be frustrated and angry anymore. And it's hard to learn. It's like, as an adult learner, you probably have a home that you go home to at night, which has distractions, including, for many of you, lack of sleep due to young ones or folks who have young ones above or below you in terms of your apartment building. You probably have the pressures of having coworkers who maybe are not quite in sync with how you want to think about things. You've got time pressures in terms of projects that are due. And Git isn't really your main job. At least for many of you, it's probably not your main job. It's just how you store the artifacts of your main job. So the only time that you need to use Git is in really high pressure situations when you don't want to lose your work. And that makes the experience even more anxiety driven for a lot of people. And the way that we tend to teach Git workshops is sort of this, it's super simple. There's just a couple of commands that you need to run. You'll initialize the Git directory. You'll throw a couple of files in there. You'll do your first commit. Ta-da, you're using Git. That's not really how we use Git in the real world, but it tends to be how we teach people to use Git. And there's a big disconnect between the two. So it is difficult to go from those beginner workshops back to work and figure out how to apply those commands that you learned in that workshop into the experience of your job. You don't have the bridges that are necessary. if we think about learning theory, and Piaget, Papin, and Montessori all talked about how children, as they grow up, need to build on previous knowledge. They need to have something that they learn, and then they add a little bit to it, a little bit to it, a little bit to it, a little bit to it. And the way that we, as adult educators, or as the educators of adults, think about this, 1970s, we had this guy called Bloom, and he helped us to take the different types of learning and put it into a taxonomy system. And at the bottom, in terms of those, when you're working with the infants, they don't have vocabulary to start. So the first things we need to do, we need to teach those children basic language skills. We need to teach them how to walk. We need to teach them these memorization pieces. And ultimately, we sort of gradually build the infant's skills up to the point where they're working in knowledge work. So we've got the foundation skills and then the knowledge work. And that division tends to be something that, as Git educators, those workshops where you throw a bunch of commands at people and they have to memorize them, they're all in the foundation space. But they get back to work, and there's not really a way to understand how to apply that information when all of a sudden you've got a merge conflict. And maybe you studied that in class, but you're not really sure. All you were doing was pulling something down. Why do you suddenly have a conflict? That doesn't make sense. So now we need to start looking at what are the ways that we can actually take this information in these workshops and make it applicable. Well, we need to work from an adult education point of view, and adults are quite selfish as learners. They want information that is immediately relevant to them. They want to understand why, they want the rationale for why they're going to learn something, and they tend to be quite successful when they are presented with problems to solve. So going to a workshop where I memorize a bunch of commands is a very different experience to here's something that's broken, and we're going to sit down together and help you to figure out how to unbreak this thing in this workshop together. You're going to learn how to learn. The term for teaching children is pedagogy, and the term for teaching adults is andragogy. But ultimately, the difference is the learner-centered classroom experience is what we want to provide, and we want to get away from a teacher-centered or simply sort of throwing information from the stage onto the students. Now, Bloom's has been updated a little bit, so we now kind of move away from the pyramid. And we've started to recognize that it's not a pure hierarchy. Sometimes you need to memorize those commands in order to have the basic vocabulary to be able to apply the information. So if you do some searches for Bloom's taxonomy, you'll see that there's different ways to present this information. This one's one of my favorites because it implies no hierarchy at all, that you can approach the information from any one of many different slices in this pie. And at this point, many of you are probably thinking, I thought I was here to learn about Git. And this is kind of the experience that we give people when we teach Git. Because you're going along and you're giving them a whole bunch of information, and people think, well, this is interesting, but why? Like, that's nice, but I'm here and I've had a delightful lunch, and quite frankly, this is going to put me to sleep if you don't start talking about things that are relevant to my life at some point in the near future. And so you've got all this great information, and you're going to go back to work and say, well, there was something about some dude named Flower. I don't really remember what she was talking about. So we need to figure out, as educators, as coworkers, as friendly friends who will pick up the phone at ridiculous hours of the day to help with Git problems, we need to figure out how to make it less about us and less about the software and more about the people who are needing to learn this information. So we need to convert this hello world experience into something that's more problem-based. And ultimately, I've never had someone other than a Git instructor say, please memorize all of the Git commands and use only, well, they'd never say this last part, but use only rebasing when merging your work. So you need to start thinking about why it is that you've asked someone to comply with the rules, and it's tempting. It's almost the opposite of the burrito fallacy. I'll let you look that up on the internet later if you don't know the burrito fallacy. But it's this trivialization of the process of learning, and so we need to figure out how to help people experience the information and come to the conclusions by building up the knowledge instead of simply dumping the answers onto them. Or perhaps another way to phrase that is to say an interesting fact does not result in the ability to analyze, evaluate, or create an effective outcome. And that's what we want people to do when they learn Git, is to have effective outcomes, not to simply memorize that revert comes after rebase in an alphabetical listing. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about becoming an effective mentor. And I had I'll come back to, let me tell you about Carl first. I had this incredible experience in 2013. I'd just given a presentation at DrupalCon called Git Makes Me Angry Inside. And I have to say, it was incredibly well attended. And we had a lot of fun. And I got to talk about some of the things that made me incredibly frustrated as a person who's sitting down to use Git. And Carl, who just spent probably in the range of months digging through how our theme system in Drupal had been built, he'd learned all kinds of incredible ways to extract information from Drupal's code base, from the history of Drupal's code base using Git. So we sat down together in a bar off the side of a graveyard in Prague, and Carl taught me what he knows about Git. And it really changed my approach to using Git as a tool because he made it fun. Now, unfortunately, Carl doesn't scale. He is kind of expensive to fly around. It's kind of expensive to go to Prague, and the bar is really small, so you're not guaranteed to get a seat. So you can't really replicate this experience exactly. But what you can do is start thinking about some of the anti-patterns of the experience of teaching Git. So there wasn't at any point that Carl sat down with me and said, oh, it's easy, you just do it like this. And he didn't ever say to me, it's a directed acyclic graph. He was talking about the excitement of finding things inside the history of our project. And it was, Drupal's theming system has a colorful past. I will let you do your own research on that one. But it did have some really interesting bits and pieces that we were able to dig into. And Git became this tool that was kind of like an archaeological tool. And I'd never experienced it in that way. It had always, for me, been this place where I kind of shoved information if I needed to be able to retrieve it later. So the other thing that Carl didn't do was he didn't give me any hard and fast rules, because we were exploring under a very specific context how to use the tool. He didn't ever say, well, you should use rebasing, you should never use rebasing. It was all very context specific. He would say, when I'm looking for information in this way, these are the tools that I use. It is appropriate for me in this context to use the tool in this way. And that for me was, again, a big mind shift, because I wasn't left with this feeling of, well, why? Why would you do it that way? I'm better than that, or I'm worse than that. I couldn't possibly do it that way. So he made this really human experience for me. And the other thing that, again, we've got the counter argument coming up next, but the other thing that he wasn't using was he wasn't using a graphical interface. And yes, the command line interface is a graphical interface to some extent, but what it allowed me to do was to actually capture, in terms of those text commands, something that I was able to replicate and type along at the same time. I didn't need to have the same software as him installed, although we did play around a little bit with Kaleidoscope app. At the time, it was one of the best merge tools available. I still use it to this day. Really cool, allows you to do image diffs, which I think is neat, although other people may do it now. But it was about the teamwork. It was about us sitting down together to explore the experience through the use of Git. We started with a problem, and we went about solving it. So this is how I teach my workshops, generally speaking, and it is how I was teaching the Git Makes Me Angry Inside workshop, and has developed into the book Git for Teams. So here's our sample lesson. I'll run through it really quickly with you. First thing you do is you have the students write down who is on their code team. So anyone who's going to be involved, including developers, designers, project managers, clients, depending on how your team is set up, you may have tech writers, you may have QA, you may have, and they write down all of those names. And then they write down all the tasks that that person is responsible for, and I give them a few minutes to do this, and when I get blank stares, I look at them and say, but it's your job, you should be able to tell me what it is that you work on at any given, and they're like, yeah, but I'm here to learn Git. It's like, I know, but tell me what you do. Talk to me through this writing exercise about the things that you do on a daily basis. And then we talk a little bit about their system, or rather I have them talk through it on a piece of paper, and they will say what their code hosting system, if they have any automated testing gates, whatever it is, and then I admit to them that I've tricked them. Because what they're going to do next is they're going to take all of these sheets of paper, and they now basically have a checklist to create a diagram for how their system is set up. And I have them sketch out their workflow. And I give them a few sample diagrams. They're generally pretty awful because people are, they're conscious of their drawing skills. And so if I give them something horrible, then they realize they can do at least that bad. And they start to draw things out, and I'll give them a few different ways of thinking about the information. We talk a little bit about decision trees as well and making big flowcharts. We talk a little bit about branching strategies, but again, it's about expressing the information, taking it from a linear checklist into some kind of visual representation. It's my next slide. Can I? Yes. And then what I have them do is something that I'm going to force you to do now, is I have them turn to their neighbor, and I have them describe the process using this diagram that they've created about how they actually work when they do their work. And I found that something you can store in your head is one thing, but until you can say it out loud and until you can describe it to someone sitting next to you, you don't necessarily have an appreciation for the complexity that you're dealing with. Now, I'm not going to make you do the entire exercise, but I am going to make you turn to the person to your left, right, front, or back. Should be someone you don't know, at least in one of those directions. And I would like you to introduce yourself. And I would like you to say to that other person, something interesting. I would like you to say whether or not you like your branching strategy. I'm going to give you about 35 seconds, 45 seconds to do this. And some of you are like, I don't even know what our branching strategy is. So now you have something to talk about, right? So now you're actually going to have to admit to someone that you're here at a Git conference, and awkwardly, you're not really sure what your branching, you're not actually sure what a branching strategy is, but you think you may have one. So go ahead and have that little conversation. I'll be here, it's okay. You are a fantastic audience. You are amazing. All right, I'm going to pull you back. I'm going to pull you back. I know I should have had a safe word to pull you back. All right, here we go. All right, so you've just learned step number 2 in how to be an effective mentor, which is talking to people. And we do often find, and I don't know if Sid will talk about this in his presentation, but Git is a way that you can sort of sneak into what people are doing and see, are they stuck? Do they know what they're supposed to be working on next? If you're not seeing the commits showing up, then perhaps they're stuck in some way, and perhaps you can reach out proactively to ask them if they need any assistance. But I think that's a big part of learning Git. It's not sitting someone by themselves in front of a terminal or in front of a piece of software and asking them to type out things or figure things out on their own. It's sitting down with your team and working as a team. So if you would like to read a little bit more about why I come to it in this way, Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of the Oppressed is kind of an interesting read, perhaps a bit dated is the right word. It's 1960s, 1970s, but it does have an interesting way of flipping that thinking around to what is it that the learner needs to know in order to move forward with their experience. And it takes it away from it being an instructor-led teaching of Git. So finally, we're going to go into the last part of this presentation, which is to value the difficulty of trivial change. And you're like, it's just version control, right? Super simple, no problem. But it's not really super simple to just swap out your version control system, especially when you're working with extremely large teams who don't necessarily have that one-on-one connection with other people in that very large team. Turns out red hook's a thing. As a Canadian, I wasn't entirely aware of it, although as a Brit, I should have been more aware of it. This was a bumper sticker that we saw out near the place with the key lime pie. And if any of you are locals, you know exactly what I'm referring to in Brooklyn with and you see the Statue of Liberty, and it's, yeah. So there's this truck that says, now Git. And that's kind of cool, right? We're all here to Git. Well, they're referring to a different kind of Git, turns out. So think about when you sit someone down and say, our company is changing to Git. It's going to be fun. It's going to be easy. Are they hearing the now Git in a positive way, or are they hearing the now Git in terms of get out? So change management is a thing. Turns out business writers have been talking about it for a while, and there's lots of models that we can refer to. So the big one, I think I skipped. Did I skip? I did skip. All right, we're ready to go, though. So the big one for me is this, the Kotter 8 steps to change. And this process is a well-defined, well-referenced, it's got its own Wikipedia page, so you know it's for real, process that basically says across the top row, change is going to be more effective in a very, very large organization if you have management buy-in. That's what that top row effectively says. And it's saying, create a sense of urgency, gather a core team, which is going to be responsible for implementing the change, and create a vision for why you are making this change happen, why you are imposing the change onto your company. Then we come down to the next level, and as a project manager, this is typically where I live. And we need to, at this point, again, this is more effective for, or makes more sense for very large teams. You're going to find a few teams who are willing to volunteer and test out the new process. So your volunteers, you're going to enable action, generate small wins, and sustain the acceleration. And as a project manager, you can think of that line in terms of sprints. You can think of it in terms of pilot projects. You can think of it in terms of learning the lessons that you can then take to other teams. And then finally, down at the very bottom, we've got the codifying or the putting into corporate culture this change and making sure it applies and sticks, that people don't sort of start reverting back to their old ways of doing things because it's scary and hard. So when you're implementing a new piece of software, Git, some of you may already be in the process somewhere along the lines here. Some of you haven't started yet. Take the time to look to the business world for examples on how to go about implementing this change. Too often I talk to technology teams where they've been tasked with sending Git out to all the various teams, and they have no idea that there's this whole field of research that they can come back to and rely on to give them the framework on how to do that rollout. Now, the next one is kind of a little bit more controversial. If I can have it, it doesn't even want to change to it. And these are the 5 stages of grief. And I encourage you to not think of this as being simply a technical problem and people need to deal with it, but think about the grieving process as people are being forced to learn a new technology. And so Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief, you're going to go through denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally acceptance. As a former Bazaar user, so you've probably, maybe actually you've never heard of it, a long time ago, Bazaar was the sort of competing distributed version control system along with Mercurial. And tooth and nail did I fight the invasion of Git, and tooth and nail did I lose the invasion of Git. And it's for me, it was actually this process of am I going to continue fighting with this piece of software, or am I going to start thinking about why does it make me angry inside? What is it about the experience of using this software that I find so frustrating and so alienating? Why do I always feel so stupid whenever I sit down to use the software? One of the big pieces for me was the help file. When I typed git help, it used to be that it gave me a list of alphabetical commands. Turns out, I don't use the alphabet like that when I'm working with Git. So last year at the conference, I sort of politely suggested that perhaps someone could help me to figure out how to contribute to Git and make it a friendlier starting experience. And within 6 months, that change has been made. So now when you run git help on an updated version of Git, the commands are actually grouped into a workflow-esque grouping. And there's instructions on how to find more information on some of the more popular workflows. And for me, this was a mind-blowing experience to go from fighting with a piece of software to actually working with a community of developers. Like there are people who build this software, and I can talk to them, and they'll make changes with me. And the session that we had right before lunch in terms of improving that onboarding experience, it's just software. You can rewrite it if you need to. You can make that experience better, and you can help people through these different phases and sort of catch them and understand why it is that they're so frustrated and fix it for them. Because if you do want to work as an individual at your own sort of workstation and you're happily using Git yourself, fine, you'll work a lot faster as an individual. But if you want to be able to work far, and if you want to have big impact, working with the team that I do now, we're a fairly small team, but we're improving the way that we work as a team. And the things that we are able to do now, we go much faster and much farther, and we have a much bigger impact. The more onboarding that we do, the more documentation that we write, the more support that we give to our field responders who are currently working in Fiji, in Nepal, in Yemen, in Syria. They are all over the world. And the more that we can support them to make the software easier to use, the faster they can get on with their job. Maybe your job is a little bit different to mine, but you probably can provide that same experience of being the source of calm and happiness, and not sort of, well, it's just a directed acyclic graph. You just need to move where your reference point is. It's really easy. If you can take away that language and you can provide an experience that's more fun, more like sitting down with Carl at the pub, I think you'll find that people will then share that love of the software, and you'll be able to go even farther as a team. So the motivation piece, asking people what motivates them, leave room for excellence and creative solutions, celebrate the wins that you have on your team, and really focus on it being a positive experience that is human-centered and not just software-driven. If you're going to be able to provide that sense of why as well, there's not really a good reason, generally speaking, for small teams to choose Git versus something else. You know, most version control software for a very tiny team will do approximately what you need it to do with a few plugins. But as you start to scale, as you get bigger, as you want to add automation, there's lots of other things in there that are good reasons. And the more that you can say, well, there's this amazing community who's actually willing to change the help pages of their software because we found it hard to use, that ends up being, I think, another reason to say to people, you know, don't give up. Here's the whys behind it. There's this amazing community of developers who want to support you, who want you to have an amazing experience, and let's see if we can work together to figure out what the sticking points are, to make the software better, to make the experience better, because you'll be helping the next person. So here we go. We went through 3 basic topics today. We learned how adults learn. I gave you kind of the equivalent experience to how many people learn Git in terms of giving you really interesting but kind of irrelevant information about adult learning theory. We then talked a little bit about becoming an effective mentor. You turned around, you learned how to talk to the people around you. You were actually a very good audience for this. I've done this in other places where people just sort of look at me like, no, but like, you want me to talk to this? I don't know them though. Like, that's not how introverts do things. We sit here and you sit there, and like, so well done, 2 thumbs up for you. And then finally, to use frameworks and value the difficulty of trivial change, to be prepared for some of the emotions that you may have come back to you if you are asked to implement a new piece of software, and one that has such a delightful reputation as Git. It's, in the actual manual page, it does refer to itself as the stupid content tracker. Perhaps this will be this year's change to move from the stupid content tracker to the simple content tracker. So there's my request for this year. 2 weeks ago, brilliant, I love it. See, this is how out of date I am. But this is, these are the kinds of things. This is a community that is in change. This is not something that is a static piece of software that you install once and forget about. It's a vibrant community, and shockingly so for me. So thank you very much for your attention today, and thank you for the update. I'm delighted to know it's no longer the stupid content tracker. Thank you.
Awesome as always. Thank you.